A mother sits in a dim Victorian parlour, her hands gently resting on the shoulders of a little girl. The child's eyes are half closed, her posture still, her skin unnaturally pale. At first glance it looks like an ordinary portrait, until you notice the truth. The girl is dead. The woman in the image is Emma Voss, a widow from London in the late 1800s. The child was her daughter, Clara, who died of scarlet fever at just 7 years old. Yet Emma could not let her go. She kept Clara's body for days, dressing and posing her for photographs. Convinced that the camera could somehow preserve her spirit, this single photograph, once hidden, now rediscovered, has ignited a disturbing question that still haunts historians today. Was Emma driven by unbearable grief? Or by something darker? Was she a mother clinging to love, or a woman descending into madness? To understand Emma's obsession, we must step into a time when death was part of daily life, when Victorians made art from grief, and mourning became a ritual. Black veils, hair jewelry, and the eerie art of post-mortem photography. It was a world where the line between life and death blurred, and where one photograph could become a desperate act of devotion or insanity. In the 1800s, death was not something people could hide from. It visited every home, silently, suddenly, and left families in mourning for years. But in the Victorian era, grief wasn't just an emotion, it became an art form. The Industrial Revolution had transformed cities into crowded, disease-ridden labyrinths. Cholera, scarlet fever, tuberculosis. These were names whispered daily. With high infant mortality and little medical understanding, every family faced loss. And from that constant tragedy, a strange culture of beautifying death was born. Black crepe dresses became the fashion of the grieving. Women, especially mothers and widows, were expected to mourn publicly and perfectly. For months, sometimes years, they wore black from head to toe. Even jewelry turned morbid. Lockets filled with a dead child's hair, rings made from woven strands, brooches shaped like coffins. Mourning was not private sorrow, it was a performance of virtue. Queen Victoria herself set the standard. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, she dressed in black for the rest of her life. The empire followed her example. Shops thrived, selling mourning gowns, veils, and jet-black ornaments. Entire industries revolved around grief. Death for the Victorians was not taboo, it was fashionable, but it was photography that transformed grief into something eternal. When the first cameras arrived in the 1840s, they brought the promise of immortality. Before this, portraits were expensive paintings. Only the wealthy could preserve a likeness. But now, with daguerreotypes and tintypes, any family could hold onto a face forever. That was when post-mortem photography, known quietly as mourning portraits, became a phenomenon. Photographers were often called into homes just hours after death. They would carefully pose the deceased, propped in chairs, resting on beds, sometimes surrounded by flowers or siblings. The goal was not horror, it was serenity. Death was softened, made beautiful, made still. Parents posed with their dead children, husbands beside their departed wives. The eyes of the dead were sometimes painted open afterward to give the illusion of life. A child might be photographed with a favorite toy or a small book placed in their hands. The result was something heartbreakingly tender, a moment of eternal sleep caught in silver and light. These images were often displayed prominently in homes or kept in albums beside photographs of the living. The Victorians did not see this as morbid. They saw it as love. To them, the photograph wasn't a record of loss. It was proof that death could not erase connection. Behind this culture lay powerful spiritual beliefs. The Victorians lived at the edge of science and faith. They believed in God, but they also longed for evidence, something tangible that souls endured beyond the grave. That hunger birthed the spiritualist movement, seances, table-turning, spirit photography. Mediums claimed they could summon the dead. Photographers claimed they could capture ghosts. Double exposures and long exposures produced ethereal blurs that believers swore were spirits. To a society grieving endlessly, these illusions offered comfort, the idea that technology could bridge heaven and earth, and at the center of it all stood women. In the Victorian imagination, womanhood was tied to purity, fragility, and feeling. A good woman was gentle and self-sacrificing, especially in mourning. A mother was expected to grieve beautifully. A widow was expected to remain loyal to her husband's memory, sometimes forever. Grief became a kind of moral test. To fail to mourn properly was to fail as a woman. Magazines, etiquette books, and sermons dictated how long one should wear black, how one should weep, even how to arrange mourning portraits. Tears were a sign of virtue. Restraint was not strength but coldness, and so many women turned their sorrow inward, transforming it into ritual. They kept shrines in bedrooms, letters tied in ribbons, locks of hair sealed in envelopes. They guarded the memory of the dead as sacred relics. In a world where women had little control over their lives, mourning was one domain they ruled completely. But for some, like Emma Voss, that control became an obsession. When Emma lost her daughter Clara to scarlet fever, she entered this world of structured sorrow. Her community expected her to embody grief, to wear black, to withdraw, to preserve her daughter's memory with grace. And Emma did all that, and more. She called for the local photographer the day after Clara's death, but witnesses said she refused to let him leave. She asked for more photographs, one with Clara in her arms, one of the two of them seated, another with Clara's doll. She insisted the child still had warmth. She asked the photographer to wait for her eyes to open. To outsiders, this was madness. But to Emma, it was love, the only form of love she had left. In the photographs, she looks calm, composed, and eerily peaceful. Her gloved hands rest on her daughter's shoulders. Her expression doesn't reveal horror, it reveals devotion. In that frozen moment, she became what Victorian society demanded, the perfect mourner, the eternal mother who never stops loving, never stops grieving, and yet, beneath that stillness lies something deeper, the unspoken fear that love could outlast sanity. Because in the end, no one embodied the ideals of Victorian mourning, the beauty, the tragedy and the madness of it, more completely than Emma Voss. The night was cold, unnaturally still for March. The Voss house sat in silence, its windows dark except for one faint glow from the upstairs parlour. Inside, Emma Voss paced the floor in her mourning dress, holding a candle that trembled in her hand. It had been 3 days since Clara's death, and yet the house still felt alive with her presence. The servants had been dismissed, the doctor's notes destroyed, and when Henry asked if he should arrange the burial, Emma simply said, "Not yet. She isn't ready to leave me." That same evening, she sent a messenger to summon Mr. Alcott, a local photographer known for his post-mortem portraits, a grim but profitable trade in Victorian America. He arrived just after midnight, his young assistant with him. The man later said he had never seen a mother's eyes so calm, nor a house so cold. The parlour was prepared like a studio. Thick curtains drawn tight, mirrors covered in black cloth, a common superstition of the time meant to prevent the dead from trapping their souls in reflections. A single oil lamp burned near the fireplace, its light pale and uneven. On the settee lay Clara, dressed in white lace, her hands folded neatly, her hair brushed and tied with ribbon. To the untrained eye, she could have been sleeping. But the room's chill betrayed the truth. Mr. Alcott hesitated. He had done such work before, but never under such strange circumstances. Most families wished for closure, a final memento before burial. But Emma wanted something more. She wanted her daughter to look alive. She asked him to position Clara upright, seated on a wooden chair. The photographer refused at first, saying the body would not hold. Emma didn't listen. She brought out a brace from the storage room, an iron stand used for portraits that required long exposures, and insisted he use it. She was always so poised, Emma said softly. She wouldn't want to be seen lying down. So, reluctantly, they did as she asked. The assistant later recalled that the air in the room was thick and, like it, didn't move. He said the mother stood so close to the child that her shadow almost covered her, completely. Each time the photographer adjusted his lens, Emma would smooth Clara's hair or tilt her chin slightly upward. When Alcott asked her to step aside, she whispered, "Just one more moment. She's not ready." The assistant noted that Emma seemed to wait for Clara to respond, as if expecting her daughter's eyes to open. The camera's bulb flashed once, flooding the room in white light. The faint smell of chemicals and collodion and ether hung in the air. Then another flash, and another. "Please," Emma said again, "one more. She's still waking." Alcott finally lowered his camera and refused to continue. The exposure plates were already developing poorly in the cold. He told her gently that the session was over, but Emma didn't move. She stood beside the lifeless child, brushing the dust from the dress, whispering, "She's still with me. Don't you see it? She's still here." When Alcott and his assistant left, the clock in the hall read nearly 3 in the morning. They said Emma was still standing there when the door closed behind them. Days passed. The undertaker came twice, then stopped coming altogether. Henry begged his wife to release the child, but Emma locked the parlor door and kept the key with her at all times. The servants reported hearing her speak softly in the nights that followed, reading stories aloud, humming lullabies, brushing the girl's hair as though she were still breathing. The smell of decay began to spread through the hallways, faint at first, then unbearable. Still, Emma refused to open the window. When the pastor arrived for a final prayer, she wouldn't let him in. "God already knows she's mine," she said through the door. The family's reputation began to crumble. Neighbors whispered that Emma had gone mad. Children dared each other to run past the Voss house, claiming you could see a shadow in the upstairs window that wasn't hers. 2 weeks later, the photograph surfaced. Someone, likely Alcott's assistant, had copied the plate in secret. The image spread quietly through town. A black and white portrait of a mother and her daughter, the little girl propped upright in her chair, eyes closed, lips faintly parted. Emma sat beside her, one gloved hand on the child's shoulder, her gaze turned slightly toward the camera. Her expression was calm, almost proud. The photograph was labeled "The Sleeping Angel." At first, people were moved by it. Victorian society had grown accustomed to post-mortem portraits. They were seen as gentle memorials, a way of preserving the beauty of the dead. But this one was different. There was something unnatural about it. The angle of the neck, the stiffness of the hands, the faint blur of movement around the mother's eyes. It didn't feel like a goodbye. It felt like possession. Some said you could see Emma's reflection in her daughter's pupils, faint like a ghost staring back. Others swore her hand was gripping the child's shoulder too tightly, as if holding her in place. Within weeks, the photo became infamous, whispered about in parlors and newspaper columns. A few claimed it was proof of unnatural devotion. Others said it was evidence that Emma Voss had lost her soul along with her daughters. Henry eventually forced open the parlor door. What he found ended any hope of saving his wife's sanity. The chair had been moved closer to the fire to keep her warm. A music box played softly nearby. The walls were covered with flowers, dried now, their scent heavy and sweet. And in the center, still dressed in white, sat Clara. Emma was asleep on the floor beside her, one hand resting on the child's knee. When Henry woke her, she smiled faintly and said, "She's only resting. Don't wake her yet." The next morning, the undertaker came one last time. The burial took place quietly, with no guests, no ceremony, and no music. Emma did not attend. For months afterward, the Voss home remained shuttered, curtains drawn, mirrors still covered. But the photograph, the sleeping angel, continued to circulate, reaching towns far beyond Massachusetts. It was shown in curiosity exhibits, even reprinted in tabloid papers as an example of maternal madness. And wherever it appeared, the same question followed. Was it a portrait of love, or a portrait of obsession? But this was no act of art. It was an act of obsession, one that would haunt not only a family, but the entire idea of what it meant to love the dead. Now the story turns from the photograph to the town that refused to look away. The burial came and went in silence. The townspeople whispered that even in the cemetery, the air felt colder when the coffin was lowered, as if grief itself refused to settle. But back inside the Voss mansion, something else had begun to take shape, something far quieter, far darker. The parlor door remained locked, yet Emma had moved something new inside, a framed photograph. The same image the photographer had taken that dreadful night. It sat on a small table, draped in lace, surrounded by candles and fresh-cut lilies that were replaced every few days. It became, in her words, the only place where Clara still breathes. For months, Emma refused visitors. The once grand home where teas and soirees had filled the hallways with laughter turned into a tomb. When servants knocked on her door, she answered only with short, trembling words, "Bring more flowers. The air must stay clean. Don't touch the photograph." At first, Henry tolerated her grief. Friends told him that women often clung to keepsakes, A lock of hair, a child's toy, a photograph. It was normal, they said, but this was different. Emma began spending hours in the parlor, seated before the image, whispering softly to it. One dismissed maid later told the local minister that she'd heard Emma talking to the photograph late at night, full conversations as if the child were answering. She said Emma's voice would shift, higher, quieter, as if imitating her daughter's. No one believed her at first. Until Henry began hearing it too. Weeks later, Emma began writing letters, not to friends or family, but to Clara. One of them survived, preserved in a relative's journal decades later. "My sweet girl, you looked so radiant in your new photograph today. The light caught your face just right. I cleaned the frame again. Dust gathers so quickly when one lives alone. I know you can hear me. I feel it when I close my eyes. I will not let them take you again." Another letter, written months later, revealed something even stranger. "They call you dead, but they are blind. I can feel your warmth when I light the candles. I see you move when the house grows still." The handwriting became shakier over time, larger, more frantic. Her grammar unraveled. Her words circled endlessly around the same ideas. "She's still here. She's waiting." By the summer of 1873, every servant had either quit or been dismissed. One claimed Emma had accused her of looking too long at the photograph. Another said Emma had burned her own wedding portrait because it didn't deserve to share the wall. Neighbors avoided the Voss home entirely. Children made up stories that Emma had kept Clara's ghost locked inside a mirror. Local pastors began referencing her in sermons, warning of the dangers of female indulgence in mourning, and in a way, that's exactly how the medical world saw her. In the 1870s, women's grief was rarely treated with empathy. When they broke down, they were labeled hysterical, a diagnosis used for everything from depression to trauma to the simple act of weeping too long. Emma's behavior, the sleepless nights, the hallucinations, the withdrawal from society, was seen as proof of female weakness. One physician, writing in a private letter years later, mentioned her case briefly. "Mrs. V, a widow of great fortune, exhibits the symptoms of prolonged melancholia, bordering on delusion. She converses with a portrait of her deceased child and claims the girl's presence lingers in the air. The prognosis is poor. The husband has refused confinement. They didn't understand what modern psychology might call complicated grief, when mourning becomes obsession, when love decays into fixation." Emma wasn't hysterical. She was lost, somewhere between memory and denial. In her final diary entries, Emma began describing visions. She claimed the photograph breathed at night, that when she lit the candles, she saw Clara's hand twitch, just slightly. "The light moves across her face," she wrote. "Sometimes I think she blinks, though only when I'm not looking. The house feels colder when she sleeps." There were reports from a neighbor who lived across the street that she saw Emma standing by the window, holding the framed photo against her chest, rocking back and forth like she was soothing a baby. At one point, Henry tried to take the picture away. The servants said they heard screaming, a sound that didn't stop until dawn. After that night, Henry left for Boston and never returned. Emma was truly alone. Weeks turned into months. The photograph began to warp with age, the emulsion cracking, the corners curling from the heat of the candles. Still, she wouldn't replace it. She said that if she did, she'd lose the last piece of her. Every night, she'd sit before it with her sewing kit, stitching tiny dresses or repairing Clara's old ribbons. She'd lay them gently in front of the frame, gifts for a child who could no longer wear them. Some nights she claimed she saw Clara standing in the doorway. Other nights she said she felt her sit beside her, small fingers brushing against her hand. The servants who had once pitied her now avoided her completely. Even those who didn't believe in spirits swore that the house had grown colder, that whispers echoed faintly through the halls after midnight. It was as if Emma had summoned something. Whether from her grief or from the photograph itself, when word of her obsession spread, newspapers mocked her. One called her the widow of the dead. Another described her as a spectacle of sentiment. The photograph that had once been pitied now became infamous and reprinted in tabloids as proof of how grief could deform the mind. Emma never responded publicly, but her final surviving note, written months before her death, reads almost like a prayer. They call me mad, but they forget what I've seen. When a mother loves too deeply, she is neither living nor dead. She becomes something in between. The narrator's voice lowers, almost whispering, Emma didn't just lose a daughter. She lost her grasp on the living. And soon even the photograph and her final link to the world would take on a life of its own. Now we move from the house that mourned to the town that remembered. When the photograph of Clara Voss, the sleeping angel, began to circulate, it was not through any official unveiling or gallery display. It leaked. A printer's apprentice, paid in silver to produce duplicates, showed one to his friend at the local church. Within days, whispers moved faster than any telegraph. Mothers shielded their children's eyes. Pastors used it as a sermon warning. And the name Emma Voss transformed overnight, from a symbol of maternal devotion to an emblem of blasphemy. Victorian society, for all its fascination with mourning, had limits. Death could be romanticized, even sentimentalized, but never disrupted. There were rules. You mourn, you bury, you move on. Emma had broken that sacred order. She had turned death itself into performance. The church elders were the first to condemn her. From the pulpit, Reverend Thomas Gates spoke of a mother who toys with the divine boundary between life and death. Parishioners nodded, murmuring. Within weeks, Emma's pew sat empty. Children passing her gate crossed themselves. The florist refused her orders. Even her servants, loyal for years, began to leave one by one, claiming unholy whispers echoed from the sitting room at night. And yet, inside that decaying mansion, Emma clung to ritual. She dusted the photograph daily, draped it in new lace each Sunday, arranged fresh lilies, though their scent turned heavy and sickly in the stagnant air. The walls yellowed, the drapes gathered mold. The house, once the envy of the neighborhood, began to rot from the inside, like a mausoleum pretending to be a home. Her husband, Charles Voss, endured it in silence for a time. The newspapers called him the grieving merchant, but grief was not what hollowed him out. It was fear. Letters found later, never sent, reveal a man trying to reason with madness. Emma, she is gone. You must rest. Please let her sleep. But Emma never answered. One winter, Charles left for Boston on business. He never returned. Some say he fled the scandal. Others whispered he remarried under another name. Emma, meanwhile, stopped leaving the house entirely. Her servants gone, her husband vanished. Her world shrank to the single-framed photograph in the parlor. Neighbors began to talk of lights flickering in the window late at night, of a shadowed figure pacing before the glass. Some swore they heard a lullaby, soft, tremulous, carried on the wind. Children dared each other to run up the Voss porch and touch the door. None lasted more than a second. They called her the mother of the dead. In the newspapers, her name became folklore, a woman undone by grief. But to those who lived nearby, she was something more spectral, an omen, a reminder that beneath the velvet mourning gowns and perfect portraits of the Victorian age lay something festering, a quiet hysteria born from loneliness and control. Inside that silent house, Emma's obsession deepened into something beyond comprehension. She believed Clara's spirit lingered in the image, trapped between worlds. The photograph was no longer memory. It was medium. She began writing letters to her daughter, leaving them under the frame as if waiting for a reply. Years passed. Curtains sealed out the sun. Dust settled like snow. The Voss estate, once alive with music and laughter, became a tomb of whispers. Emma was seen less and less, her silhouette only visible when candlelight flickered behind the lace curtains. And yet, she wasn't done, because somewhere in the house, beyond the photograph, beyond the parlor, there were rumors of something else, something she created in the dark. But Emma Voss's obsession didn't end with a photograph, when the image could no longer hold her daughter's PR. The story of Emma Voss might have ended quietly, her name fading into the archives of small-town gossip, if not for what was discovered decades later. In the spring of 1896, the Voss residence was finally unsealed. For years, the mansion had stood boarded and silent, claimed by ivy and time. When the town council ordered its inspection, 2 men from the parish entered through the warped front door. What they found was not a home but a crypt. Dust hung thick as fog. Furniture lay draped in white cloth, as if frozen mid-funeral. Every mirror had been turned toward the wall, and there in the parlor they found Emma. Her body was slumped beside a chair, skeletal, dressed in black silk, long out of fashion, hands folded neatly in her lap. In front of her stood the photograph, still framed in tarnished silver. The glass had cracked down the center, splitting her daughter's serene face in two. On the mantel, a candle had long since burned itself to the base, and beneath the photograph, tucked between yellowed letters, was a final note in Emma's handwriting. If the eyes could open once more, I would follow her into the light. The coroner's report listed her death simply as natural causes. But what lingered was not the manner of her death, it was what she left behind. Among the inspectors was a young historian named Jonathan Pell. He was the one who found the locked drawer in Emma's writing desk. Inside, preserved between layers of linen, was the original photograph of Clara Voss, the sleeping angel. Pell's journal describes it vividly. The clarity is haunting. The child's cheeks bear a faint blush, her lips parted as if mid-breath. The mother's hand, visible in the corner of the frame, appears almost possessive, as though holding her in place. That photograph would ignite one of the strangest debates in the history of post-mortem art. For over a century, historians, pathologists, and art critics have argued over a single question. Was Clara Voss dead when the photograph was taken? Some experts insist yes, pointing to the rigidity of her posture, the dullness of the eyes, the way the shadows fall unnaturally across her face. They compare it to known examples of 19th-century death photography, where the deceased were often propped upright with hidden stands and retouched afterward to appear alive. Others disagree. They claim the slight tilt of Clara's head, the faint curve of her mouth, suggest a living subject, posed deliberately to mimic the look of death. To them, Emma's photograph was not memorial, but prophecy. One theory argues that Emma, consumed by fear of losing her child, staged the photo before Clara's death, an attempt to preserve her as she imagined she would soon be. A practice portrait, some call it, a rehearsal for grief. If that's true, then the image is far more disturbing than post-mortem art. It becomes the product of a mind rehearsing loss before it happens. A few fringe psychologists have gone further, suggesting early evidence of a delusional disorder. In her letters, Emma often wrote of Clara as both present and absent, as if she exists on the other side of the glass. One doctor in a 1912 journal described it as a form of anticipatory morning psychosis, a mother grieving the living child she feared she would soon lose. Others, however, see in the photograph not madness but artistry, a macabre precursor to surrealism, capturing the threshold between life and death, that fleeting moment when one becomes the other. They point to Emma's precision, her composition, the emotional power of the image. It's too deliberate, one curator remarked, to be mere grief. Its obsession turned into art. In 1973, when the photograph resurfaced at a private auction in Boston, experts from Harvard's Peabody Museum examined it under magnification. The results only deepened the mystery. There were no clear signs of post-mortem staging, no visible support rods, no stiffened joints. But there was evidence of hand retouching, especially around the eyes, as if Emma had painted over the image herself, to restore a lifelike gaze. Was that the act of a mother trying to remember her daughter as she was, or an artist attempting to resurrect her in image form? No one can say for certain. Even today, the sleeping angel is displayed only occasionally, usually behind black velvet curtains. Viewers describe it as peaceful yet wrong, beautiful, until you realize what you're looking at. The photograph defies categorization. It's neither portrait nor relic, neither entirely of the living nor the dead. And that is the haunting legacy of Emma Voss, a mother who could not let go. A woman who blurred the line between memory and possession. A photographer, whether by accident or by madness, who captured the impossible. In the end, all that remains is ambiguity. Every historian who studies the image eventually faces the same question, the one no one can answer. Was Clara Voss already gone when her mother took that photograph? Why did Emma pose her living daughter to look like death, so she could hold on to her forever? Perhaps both answers are true, because grief in its deepest form is not about what we've lost. It's about what we refuse to release. No one could ever agree if the photograph showed life. or the moment it ended. There's something strange about how the Victorians looked at death, something both terrifying and tender. To them, loss wasn't a moment. It was a process, a ritual, a ceremony to make sense of what the living could not accept. In that world, mourning wasn't hidden behind closed doors. It was performed. Dresses turned black for months, sometimes years. Locks of hair became jewelry. Rooms were draped in velvet, mirrors covered, clocks stopped at the moment of passing. Death wasn't a visitor. It lived among them. And in that darkness, photography became their light. When the first cameras arrived in the 1840s, they were seen as almost mystical, a way to trap time, to hold a soul still. A photograph wasn't just a likeness, it was presence. Families could touch an image and believe, if only for a second, that someone was still there. So perhaps Emma Voss wasn't unusual. Perhaps she was only doing what her century allowed, loving someone so much that she refused to let them disappear. After all, the line between love and obsession is drawn by the living, not the grieving. If we look at Emma's photograph now, it's easy to feel disturbed. The shadows, the stillness, the way Clara's eyes seem to follow you even after you look away. But beneath that unease lies something profoundly human, a refusal to surrender to time. Emma Voss didn't want a memory. She wanted continuity. She wanted proof that her daughter's existence could outlast her own. And in that desire, she became a mirror of us all. Every one of us who's ever scrolled through old pictures, replayed a voice note, or stared at a photo long after someone's gone, hoping to feel them breathe again through pixels and light, because grief doesn't vanish, it just changes form. And in 1872, that form was glass, silver, and shadow. It's easy to label Emma as unwell, even deranged, a woman who crossed into madness. But what if she wasn't? What if she was simply honest about something most people try to hide? That love is possessive, desperate, and sometimes unwilling to accept death's finality. In a sense, her photograph was not about death. It was a protest against it, a rebellion of tenderness against the inevitable. When modern eyes look at the sleeping angel, they see horror. But when Emma looked at it, she saw hope, a stillness that could hold her daughter forever, even if it meant defying nature itself. And maybe that's the cruel irony of photography. It preserves everything except what truly mattered. The warmth, the voice, the heartbeat, all gone. Only the surface remains perfectly still. That's why the image feels so haunting, because it captured not just Clara's face, but Emma's refusal to accept loss. Every shadow, every retouched line of the eyes whispers the same plea. Stay. We often say a photograph freezes time, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just traps emotion, the moment before collapse, the breath before goodbye. Emma Voss's picture isn't just a portrait of death. It's a portrait of resistance, and maybe that's what makes it timeless. In her grief, Emma unknowingly created something immortal, something that speaks to every generation that follows. A reminder that technology can't separate love from pain. It only immortalizes the moment they meet. So perhaps Emma Voss wasn't mad. Perhaps she was just a mother trying to stop time, a woman who couldn't accept that the world moves on, even when your heart doesn't. And when we stare at that image today, when we feel that same chill, that same quiet ache, maybe we're not reacting to her madness at all. Maybe we're reacting to her honesty, because grief never really ends. It lingers, like a photograph fading in the light, like a name you still whisper out of habit. Emma Voss became the ghost she feared, not haunting her home, but haunting the idea that love could ever truly let go. Click, the sound of a camera shutter, a moment sealed forever, a fragment of love suspended between two worlds, one alive, one remembered. In her photograph, Clara still looks back, not as the dead, but as the memory Emma refused to let die, fade out. The screen darkens. Just before it cuts to black, a faint echo of a camera shutter plays again. If you believe some photographs hold more than memory, you're not alone. Subscribe for more forgotten stories, where history's darkest moments still find a way to speak.